Good morning or afternoon or evening as appropriate, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Eli Dorado, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's panel on the regulatory and permitting challenges facing geothermal energy. Unlike many of you, I don't come to the geothermal world by way of the oil and gas industry. I'm a policy researcher at Utah State University's Center for Growth and Opportunity, where I focus on removing the barriers to transformative technologies that will lead to a radically more prosperous world. And when I learned that there are orders of magnitude more energy in the form of heat in Earth's crust than in all the fissionable material and all fossil fuels everywhere on the planet, I realized I had to be part of the search for policy solutions to help unlock this enormous energy resource. We have an experienced, distinguished, and excellent panel today to discuss the real world policy obstacles that face the geothermal industry. And so we'll bring our panelists up on stage now, and I will ask each one of them to take a minute to introduce themselves, their employers, and what they work on. So 1 minute, and let's please start with Lorenzo Trimble.
Hi, my name is Lorenzo Trimble. I work for the Bureau of Land Management as the National Geothermal Program Lead in the headquarters Fluid Minerals Division, otherwise called HQ 310. And I work on reviewing legislation, issuing guidance to field office staff. I work a lot on developing training materials for our staff, as well as helping them with any kind of questions they may have. And so that's pretty much the job I have. And I've been doing it now for, at the Washington office or headquarters, sorry, for about 5 years. And I'd worked at the Nevada State office before that for about 7 years, a little over 7 years. And so where I also did geothermal and dealt with drilling permits, unit agreements, operations plans, utilization plans, and the like. So I've been dealing with permitting geothermal projects for about 12 years now overall. So thanks for having me, and happy to be here.
Yeah, welcome. And let's do Aaron Levine next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aaron Levine. I'm the Senior Legal and Regulatory Analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm an attorney by trade. I've been researching and analyzing geothermal permitting and regulatory issues for about a decade now at the laboratory. I've worked closely with some of my counterparts here on this panel to understand industry perspectives and perspectives from Lorenzo and the BLM. And I'm excited to be here and talk about some of the challenges facing this industry.
Well, fantastic. Welcome, Aaron. Paul Thompson, let's do you next.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Ormat Technologies. Today, we operate just over 1 gigawatt of geothermal generation. I'm responsible for that generation in the Americas. And prior to that, I worked for 2 United States senators and served as a governor's energy advisor and chairman of a public utilities commission. So I often like to say I'm a recovering regulator. And by far, the biggest hurdle we have in developing projects and meeting the huge new demand in the Western US is a regulatory permitting issue of trying to get these projects developed as quickly as possible. And as unique as geothermal is, I think there's a lot of exciting developments on the horizon that are going to allow us to kind of meet these new demands as California requests 1,000 megawatts of new geothermal and other Western states achieve high renewable portfolio saturation. More and more geothermal is going to have to be developed. And I'm excited to be here to discuss these new exciting opportunities.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome. And last but not least, Cathy Henderson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. It's a great delight to be here. And I've been listening to basically many of the sessions over the last few days. And of course, regulatory hurdles have come up time and time again, and the length of time to get a project going. So I'm a geologist. I've actually been in the industry for 40 years, and I note there's a lot of newbies out there and, and geothermal wannabes. And of course, one of the things that they need to learn about is, in fact, the regulatory framework. So I've had the opportunity as a senior executive to work internationally and in many jurisdictions in South America, Chile, Peru, Argentina. I've also worked in jurisdictions like Iceland and New Zealand that have a very well-defined regulatory framework. And now I'm the CEO of Alberta #1, and we're trying to get a conventional geothermal project going in a very highly regulated province of Canada with a significant oil and gas industry.
Okay, welcome, Cathy. So thanks. And Lorenzo, I want to kick off the discussion with you. I hope this will be a free-flowing discussion with everybody just popping in as they see fit. But Lorenzo, I was hoping you could kick us off by just saying, giving us a broad overview of, kind of where we are on permitting right now for geothermal.
With geothermal, the regulations that we have at 43 CFR 3200, first there's leasing. Post-leasing, typically we'll see exploration occur under the 3250 regulations, which would be geophysical in nature typically, and will likely include temperature gradient wells. And so we can permit those kinds of things sometimes with a casual use. And we do have one categorical exclusion available for the temperature gradient wells, which unfortunately does not allow for temporary or new road construction, which makes it difficult to use that. With a temperature gradient well, because it's considered exploration, it cannot penetrate into a geothermal resource. So it can't be used to confirm the existence of a geothermal resource. So if a company or a proponent uses the exploration part of the regulations 3250, they're just getting to that point where they think there might be a geothermal resource there. And then typically if they do, they'll come back and submit a plan which accords to the 43 CFR 3260s, which is the geothermal operations section of our regulations. And so that's where they will propose wells, well pads, access roads, and those types of things to drill wells under a geothermal drilling permit, which would be allowed to penetrate and confirm the existence of a geothermal resource. Usually a proponent has to submit that. It has to go through NEPA. In geothermal, it's almost always an environmental assessment, NEA. And if a resource exists and the proponent decides to move on and develop power plants, they submit what's called a utilization plan, which is outlined in the 43 CFR 3270 regulations, which are called utilization operations. And in there, that's where they would propose a power plant, where the power plant would be located, any additional roads, any additional well pads, pipelines, transmission lines, so that then that gets analyzed under NEPA. Typically, again, it would be an EA, environmental assessment. We have had a couple of instances where they've required an environmental impact statement in EIS. So that's pretty much a good rundown of the regulatory framework that we have for federal.
And Paul,
if I can jump in, Eli, I think that was a great summary by Lorenzo, and I think what sets geothermal apart, and I think as all these folks to pivot are kind of looking at geothermal and comparing it to oil and gas, is we have to confirm the geothermal reservoir first, and then we have to try to build a power plant. So we go through kind of double permitting, if you will, compared to other energy developers. A solar developer, for example, can, kind of look at radiation and solar radiation. It doesn't need to do a 2-year environmental permitting process to kind of know where that solar resource is. A wind developer puts up an anemometer and can kind of get that data. We have to go drill these wells. And what we are typically seeing on BLM, and I don't know how fluent our audience is, so that's the Bureau of Land Management lands. Those are federally managed lands. I grew up in Austin, Texas, and had never heard of BLM lands. But when we try to do this on federal lands, we have to do that exploration permitting, which can really take 12 to 24 months just to be able to drill this kind of exploration wells to encounter the reservoir. And as Lorenzo talked about, that categorical exclusion is key, but because you can't encounter the reservoir, we really don't know kind of what the geothermal potential is. And so there's some exciting developments in Congress I'm sure we'll get to say, can we treat geothermal like the oil and gas industry and expand upon that categorical exclusion so that we can go out and do exploration very aggressively to know where the resource is, and then start the 1 to 2 year permitting process just to find the resource. Then we get to start another 1 to 2 year process to permit the power plant or the utilization plan. And so quick math there, 4 to 5 years to permit a project is what we're always working with. And I think that's what, when Cathy talked about, kind of the newcomers and so forth, we are hearing regulators and folks today, and probably everybody on the previous panels talking about, let's do this quickly. And we say, boy, you've got a kind of a long lead time to get there. So we're seeing some work on categorical exclusion. And I think BLM has also been really good at allowing us to permit both exploration and utilization plan simultaneously. What Lorenzo didn't say, and what I'll stop on, is that he worked in Nevada, which was probably one of the most progressive and forward-looking states for geothermal development. Hundreds and hundreds of megawatts have been developed in Nevada. When you start to branch out to other states, the BLM offices are a little bit more reluctant. They don't kind of understand some of this technology. And so what we've been asking the new assistant secretary and others is to say, A, can we ramp up staffing? Can we clone Lorenzo so there's more of him in other places? And then can we get some transparency on how much geothermal are you permitting? Like many of us, if you have a difficult product or a difficult process that you don't really understand, you may procrastinate on it. You may put it at the bottom of your to-do pile. And the time is now to kind of bring those up and start working on them as fast as possible. The last thing I'll say is that because these projects are somewhat complicated, we have seen that in the federal permitting process, many of the offices that work on these projects want to work on them in serial process. They want to do one project, they want to finish it, and they want to move to the next one. If we want to see the full geothermal potential come to life quickly and put tons of people to work and create unparalleled economic impact in low economic areas and so forth, we need to be permitting all of these projects simultaneously. We can't do them one after the other. So that is the other thing we're pushing, is to say a lot of these geothermal projects tend to be kind of in similar locations with similar geology, dealing with the same offices. Can we get them more staff, and can we do a lot of these projects simultaneously? Those are huge improvements that I think we can make, and I can't thank Lorenzo enough for being here on behalf of the Bureau of Land Management, because it is so key to what we're going to do in geothermal moving forward.
Well, let's get Cathy's perspective. So Cathy, it sounds like in the US, the big problem is all these NEPA reviews that have to be done multiple times and so on. And so Canada, where you're operating, doesn't have NEPA. So it must be completely straightforward to get a well license, right?
I wish that were true. Anyway, so to kind of jump on Paul's comments is that, the issue with Canada is we do not have a geothermal industry. So what the regulators are trying to grapple with is, what is the geothermal industry? And how does the geothermal industry operate in the context of significant regulatory frameworks already in existence for oil and gas? So I'm talking specifically about Alberta and Saskatchewan. And we've had very good collaboration with the Alberta government. But it's very hard. If you can imagine hundreds of pages of regulatory requirements. So we don't have NEPA, but we have other equivalent kinds of things. And in the geothermal industry, what we want to make sure is public safety. right? So we are very happy to comply with all of the health and safety regulations that currently exist for well drilling. Many of the wells we anticipate will be sour wells. So there's a regulatory framework that is you know, how you drill wells into a sour reservoir. But one of the things that I've been trying to push for is particularly in Alberta, is heat as a commodity. So in the Alberta regulatory framework, natural gas, petroleum or oil, metallic minerals and industrial minerals are all regulated as commodities. And what I've been trying to say to the Alberta government is let's consider heat the commodity. And what we can do in geothermal is we can extract that heat without impacting those other commodities. We can actually do co-production. It has been proven not just in Alberta, but in other jurisdictions around the world. So fine, if you have the rights to the hydrocarbons, no problem. We'll organize or arrange a business deal for you to have access to the hydrocarbons that you have rights to. There happens to be lithium down there. We've heard a lot in this conference about lithium. Well, that's fine. You can extract the lithium from the brines which are being produced by the geothermal project. And then we've also heard a significant amount about carbon sequestration. Well, we also believe in Alberta #1 that carbon sequestration can be part of our project. It's an important part. And I think, and based on what you've been hearing for the last few days, I think it's a significant game changer for making projects in jurisdictions which have significant oil and gas production already, but making those projects much more commercially viable. So what I would be asking, and I am asking the regulator, is you need to have this holistic view of geothermal. It's not just extraction of a fluid out of the ground. It is extraction of that fluid, separation of the various commodities, and you need to have a regulatory framework that encompasses that and embraces that.
Thanks, Cathy. Let me go to Aaron, and Aaron, I was hoping you could tee us up with, why geothermal? Why are our national research labs investing money in this technology? What do you think that policymakers see it as a valuable part of the energy mix?
Yeah, I think Paul started to hit on this. As we see these high penetrations of variable renewable energies such as wind and solar, we don't have the storage capabilities at this point to have 100% grid of wind and solar. And because of that, we need 24/7 baseload power that can provide power to a lot of industries that are working around the clock, whether it's mining, whether it's server farms, whether it's Las Vegas and the Strip. We need power that can be provided 24/7. And there's only a few technologies that meet a lot of these renewable requirements, whether they're clean energy standards or renewable portfolio standard requirements at the state level, that can fit that bill. And geothermal is primed to be one of those, if not the leading one of those, both from an electricity generation standpoint, but also from a heat standpoint. We've talked about this as the heat as the commodity aspect. And from that standpoint, if we can use the heat directly, we can save electrons, and we won't need as many electrons, particularly as we see this push for high electrification, where we see conversion of a lot of our traditional, say, natural gas powered heating, cooling systems, things of that nature, to a electric system. That is an inefficient conversion sometimes to have to use when you have the direct heat available, and the heat and cooling potential of geothermal at the district heating level for other industries is, I think, also an important aspect of this. But all of that really comes into play with this being a vast resource, the heat beneath our feet, as we said in our GeoVision report that we released a couple of years ago. And it's something that we're very focused on being able to tap into and leverage to the best of its capabilities.
So Cathy raised the issue of mineral rights versus petroleum rights, or how are you going to account for the heat resource? So in the U.S., the federal government considers it to be a part of the mineral estate. But at the state level, it varies very much by state. So it could be a groundwater right or something else. So I was wondering if the rest of you have experience with those different dispensations of how we're going to account for the heat. What do you guys think about that?
I'm happy to jump in, Eli.
Yeah.
I think what Cathy said is really, really critically important in a couple aspects. So number one, yes, in the Western US, it's treated as a mineral right. It is not a consumptive water use. And that is huge. In the arid West, that would have been a real game changer to say, oh, this geothermal fluid is a water right, and you get to compete with the other aquifers and et cetera. So, and the reason they did that was for exactly what Cathy said, which was we are extracting the heat. We are putting all of that geothermal fluid back into the reservoir. It's not an extractive exercise like mining or like, fossil development. And kind of bringing it back to the scope of regulatory permitting, I think everything is moving in the right direction, starting with that, which is we are not consuming the geothermal reservoir. And there have been huge strides made in geothermal technology. I often equate, the early kind of geothermal facilities, the large flash facilities and so forth to, a 1950 Chevy, if you will. The newer binary technology power plants, which are predominant in development today, are more like a Tesla. They're a closed loop system. They have no air emissions, so we can permit them through the air regulatory agencies much quicker. We can prove that there's almost zero water consumption. We can prove that the geothermal reservoir is not affected. The footprint of these facilities is getting increasingly small. For the amount of power we produce, to disturb something like 15 acres for the power plant and another 40 acres with possible well locations and pipelines across them is just stunning. We have a footprint 22 times smaller than solar or wind development for the same amount of power we produce. So all of these things are kind of leading us to this great discussion on permitting these things quickly, preserving the safety obviously for everybody involved, and kind of balancing this idea of the environment and not losing sight of the forest for the trees, because the carbon sequestration is critically important. I tend to focus on the other side. That is, if I can bring on hundreds or 1,000 megawatts of geothermal that has zero emissions recognized by the California Air Resources Board, that is so much better than trying to stuff it back in the ground, is just not to produce those emissions at all. And that is starting to take effect. And we're hearing that at the Air Resources Board, the energy commissions, the public utilities commissions. And that's why it is such an exciting time to be kind of in geothermal moving forward.
So one solution I have seen as I've talked to people throughout the industry about permitting is the idea of extending the categorical exclusion in Section 390 that already applies to the oil and gas industry on federal lands for drilling, and just extending it to also include geothermal. So I'd like to ask you guys, is that appropriate? Would that work as a solution, as a policy solution? And Lorenzo, I think maybe starting with you, like, how would it affect BLM if that were to be applied to geothermal?
Good question. How would it affect BLM? Well, I would hope that what we could do is use one of those CXs, probably CX number 1 from Section 390, which is 5 acres of disturbance for a single well, or up to 150 acres on a lease. Actually, geothermal projects, we know how many acres all of the geothermal projects in the BLM have disturbed, thanks to NREL's help, National Renewable Energy Lab, so Aaron's group. And so we know the total number of acres that our geothermal power plants have disturbed. And it comes out to 46 acres per power plant on average. So that 150 acre limit shouldn't be an issue for a whole geothermal project. So, hopefully within BLM, we could use a CX like that to be able to permit the kind of wells that would be able to penetrate a geothermal resource, at least confirm its existence, but could also possibly be used to expedite the permitting of, say, infield wells where there's an existing or operating geothermal power plant. So I would hope that ultimately it would expedite the permitting of geothermal wells so that project proponents can move more quickly to confirm or not whether a resource exists or not. And either then they can plug and abandon those wells and move on to the next project, or they can pursue developing power plants and submit a utilization plan at that point.
And Aaron, you have a great chart that's, I think, attached to your profile for this event that shows the different steps. Maybe using that as a basis, like, how would 390 simplify that chart?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, and what we've seen is the biggest risk is always in this resource confirmation phase. Once you've confirmed a resource, it's that much easier to obtain financing if necessary, receive your PPAs. And so finding ways to expedite that exploration phase to get to resource confirmation quicker, I think is key. And I think that's where the 390 CX1 could come into play. We did some analysis from funding from Lorenzo and the BLM, looking at, what is that surface disturbance to confirm a resource. And we held a workshop in conjunction with the Stanford Geothermal Workshop a couple of years ago. We interviewed a number of industry professionals in this space, and what we came up with is roughly 15 acres of surface disturbance is really about what's required to confirm that resource, to have your 2 to 3 well pads, be able to conduct flow testing. That includes reserve pits, that includes, roadways, whether that's temporary or permanent. And I think that's where you could really see this move forward. I certainly think, the infield development can be helpful. Certainly, when we're talking about improving the performance of existing plants, potentially repowering existing plants, that certainly comes into play. And these, geothermal projects, some of which have been in existence for decades now, do face those challenges from time to time where they need to kind of re-engineer the reservoir, maybe drill some new wells. But I think ultimately it really is this resource confirmation stage and just getting to that point where we can know what the resource is. Like Paul spoke of, we have tools that make it much easier to identify wind and solar resources. And because of that, the process can be much more simple. In regards to federal land, you're really looking at just a leasing process. And once they have a location, you lease it out, you look at that surface disturbance, you're done. You don't have to go through this phased approach that could be 5 years of permitting on top of what's likely a few years just to develop it without regulations, which gets you to this 8 to 10 year project timeline, which simply isn't going to fit the bill of trying to get to a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035, 2040, or even 2050.
And Paul, what do you think? Would you expand output if 390 were extended?
Absolutely. And I think Aaron and Lorenzo are being quite modest. The Department of Energy did this GeoVision study, and they said that expediting permitting could unleash 6 to 7 gigawatts of geothermal development. And I discussed earlier about we spend an incredible amount of BLM's time, blood, sweat, and tears permitting wells that we drill that may never produce anything because they're kind of in this resource confirmation phase. If we could take that off of their plate and say, let's do that under this expansion of this categorical exclusion, and then only go to them when we're saying this is going to be a long-term production well that will have a disturbance, because we can reclaim these resource confirmation wells quite easily, and have zero impact on the surrounding reservoir. And that would allow us to put all of our effort into projects that have been proven, that will come online, and use what are somewhat limited resources of time and talent at these agencies to move projects forward really expeditiously. And this has happened in Congress. We've had discussions on the expansion of the categorical exclusion. I serve as chairman of the Geothermal Rising Policy Committee. We've had multiple hearings in the House and the Senate on this. It gets a little tripped up on NEPA, because anytime you start talking about the National Environmental Protection Act, people don't want to open those doors. But we have some other vehicles. I think we have some administrative vehicles, and we've had great conversations with the Assistant Secretary of Interior, the new counselor for BLM, to look at this and say, is this something that the administration wants to put forward now under the existing categorical exclusion that BLM has, make some clarity to it, maybe put out an internal memorandum to BLM to say, let's start doing this so that, we are bringing real projects to them to permit. And I can't, echo enough, 6 to 7 gigawatts of development is a game changer for this industry. When we look at the, 1,000, maybe 2,000 megawatts we've developed over the last 50 years or longer, that can put real, people to work and see a huge shift. And, I like to say developing geothermal projects is harder, but the product is so much better. To have a resource that is firm, that's flexible, with zero emissions. And we are seeing that everywhere in the US and in Canada and in Central America are demanding this type of product. And there just aren't a lot of answers when you say, I need something that's firmly flexible with zero emissions. You start looking around and you say, man, we need as much geothermal as humanly possible. And we're starting to see that shake out. And, so this CADX is critically important. And I think also the transparency of seeing what these BLM offices are doing, enabling Lorenzo to kind of look at offices and say, this is weird. You haven't touched a geothermal permit in 5 years. Can we send you some help? Can we look at doing that there? Is it, and reassigning kind of the human power to look at these projects in different places will just be huge. And this is such a fantastic discussion to have about that, because we're starting to see that change.
Let's cover one last topic before we get to audience Q&A. And Cathy, I'm going to come to you first. But I was hoping we could talk about the ugly side of the policy world, and that is special interests. So Alberta has, a burgeoning oil and gas industry and not much geothermal industry. So what is it like as a geothermal entrant coming in? The theme of Pivot is that the oil and gas industry is moving to embrace and geothermal. But how's your experience been with that?
Really interesting, because my segue actually from my esteemed colleagues was that the situation in Canada, particularly in the oil and gas producing provinces, is actually not on the, it's on the regulatory side, but it's not the government side. I think the governments are trying to build a regulatory framework that is going to be helpful. Not sure that they're quite looking at the right, the right models, because we haven't seen that yet. But our issue in Alberta is actually more and special interest groups. And obviously those special interest groups are the oil and gas companies. And it's not clear what their concerns are. But they are concerned that in some way that the extraction of the heat will impact their reservoir. Now, on the injection side, certainly there needs to be a lot more work done on pore space utilization. So if we're combining injection with, injection of geothermal fluids with oil-filled fluids with carbon sequestration, we do need to do a lot more work on the pore space allocation side of things. But certainly the oil and gas companies that we've been talking to, and there are many, are not embracing geothermal at this point. And we need to convince them that it's what they need to do, what they have to do.
And Paul, what do you think about the special interest question? Like, are you seeing oil and gas stepping in and starting to be in favor of geothermal or block it, or what's your experience?
Well, so I look at it a little bit, and I'll give you maybe two answers, which is one, I say this cautiously that, of our 1.1 gigawatts of projects developed, we've never had one stopped or not developed due to special interests. We engage early and often, whether it's with the tribal nations, and this is not just for the US, whether it's in New Zealand or Kenya, or, when we engage early and discuss with the community and kind of explain the process to them, we can typically work through the mitigation. Lorenzo talked about these projects, are almost always EAs, environmental assessments, we don't have to do an EIS, an environmental impact statement, meaning we're going to create, we're not going to create something that we can't mitigate. So we have been able to work through that. And I would say geothermal kind of leads to that because there's a long lead time, and because we have to start exploration, we can start the conversations early. We can explain to them what we're going to do. We have such a profoundly good impact on the economic development, meaning the taxes we pay, the royalties we pay, et cetera, with a low impact on, you don't have to build a lot of new fire stations or hospitals, because these plants, once they're up and operating, are somewhat unmanned. We had a county commissioner who said they act like little ATMs in the desert. So that's really great. Pressure from oil and gas not to do geothermal? Absolutely not. I mean, I think we're actually seeing the opposite in the US, which is, some of the majors are looking at what can we do to help. And let's keep in mind that in the 80s, the geothermal industry in the US was founded by the oil and gas majors looking for this projects in Southern California and developing. We operate projects today that were drilled by Exxon and other folks. So it's kind of interesting to see them kind of coming back around. We also focus here at ORMAT on waste heat recovery, which is using exhaust heat through the same process. They are engaging massively in that today, which I see as kind of a bridge to getting to more renewable development moving forward. So I think, and as the chairman of the Geothermal Rising Policy Committee, I'm also, for the first time in 15 years, we have members from the oil and gas sector participating and wanting to be a part of it. And having Baker Hughes, as part of our policy discussion is a game changer when we go to Capitol Hill in Congress, and we are not this, little industry located in Nevada or California, but to say, look, we've got projects ranging from Texas to Hawaii to Oregon, New Mexico, et cetera. And we've got vendors and people interested, all over the country. And if we can save moving all the, rigs from California to Texas and keep them in the West doing geothermal development, I think we're going to see, our influence and ability to come to the table to discuss these issues grow immensely. This week, a CEC commissioner from California reached out to the geothermal sector to say, how do we solve some of our summer energy problems? And, it's a modest conversation. It is a huge first to have them reaching out to the geothermal sector to say, please help us. What can we do? And if we can leverage those conversations with what we've discussed here today, I think we can make huge progress on this permitting and develop projects quicker, more environmentally sound, and benefiting, the entire West and Canada as we look towards, a grid that needs reliability and all the ancillary benefits that geothermal brings.
All right,
so
thanks.
Ali, if I can just jump, sorry, if I
Go
could
ahead,
just,
Cathy. Yep.
I don't want to mean that, I don't want to imply that the oil and gas industry is not supporting geothermal. But what we've seen is everything that Paul has said. My inbox is full of queries and questions and whatnot from people in the oil and gas industry. What I want to imply, though, is that what we have not seen is actually putting their money where their mouth is. So lots of interest, lots of hype out there. You've heard it in this conference, but there was a financial session, I think it was on Tuesday. And basically in that session, it came out that the oil and gas industry is looking for 20 to 30% return on investment. That's very hard to deliver for a geothermal project. So my point is that, yes, super interested, they're thinking about it, but they haven't quite made the leap. And I certainly think having a regulatory framework that's clear, concise, and allows projects to move forward quickly is a very important element that we need to have in a, call it the commercialization expansion of geothermal.
Okay, so we have about half an hour for audience Q&A. So let's dive in here. So the first question is that it seems like the problem with categorical exclusions is that no one likes them politically, no matter how noble the cause. Oil and gas lobbied hard for the current paradigm, and there is no equivalent group for that on geothermal. And what are the panelists' thoughts? Anyone want to take that?
I can chime in here.
Yeah.
I think that there's two types of categorical exclusions, and we haven't seen many of these legislative categorical exclusions that have come from Congress, such as Section 390. More of what we see is administrative categorical exclusions that come from the agencies. And we have hundreds of them throughout the federal system. They're generally designed for projects that repeatedly show a finding of no significant impact. And once you've established that these activities are not going to result in significant impacts, then you can establish a categorical exclusion through rulemaking to support those. And I think those have been much less political, because unlike what Congress does, that is maybe at the whim of lobbyists, those are having to be backed by data, science, not violating our Administrative Procedure Act, not being arbitrary and capricious decisions from the agencies. And so I think those have had much more support. And again, we see hundreds of those throughout the federal system for all sorts of activities, whether it's putting up new poles and wires in limited circumstances, telecom industry work from the Forest Service with agriculture. So, I mean, we see all sorts of these categorical exclusions that haven't become political. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they are based on data and not a politician making a bill. And so that is one, I think, challenge that has been faced. But I think from the other side of that, part of it is education and showing that even if it is coming from the legislators, there is still justification at this point from what we've seen through experience with project development that these projects don't have significant impacts, that don't need to go through an environmental assessment to drill a few confirmation wells. I don't think anybody here is looking to remove an EA requirement when you're building a power plant. As Paul mentioned earlier, when we're talking about long-term surface impacts that are going to be there 30, 40, 50 years, I think no one is pushing back to not have an environmental assessment and to develop proper mitigation measures to support that. I think it's these small resource confirmation projects that can be easily reclaimed that aren't going to be a long-term impact to the environment is where there needs to be that understanding and knowledge base about what the activity is and what its impacts actually are.
But Aaron, I think you answered the question too. I do think the lexicon is important, and nobody likes to feel like they're excluded or somebody else is getting excluded. And so thanks to Aaron's work at NREL and his colleagues, we've started to use this word resource confirmation because I think even though the vehicle will be an administrative CX, which is what every staffer and legislator on the Hill understands, we're doing something a little different. We don't want to be excluded. We want to go through the full permitting for exploration and for the power plant development to make sure the noise doesn't affect sage grouse and the wells won't interfere with a local aquifer, et cetera. In this resource confirmation phase, we need to be able to drill quicker. And as the Geothermal Rising Policy Committee, which is advocating for this on the Hill, we are using that language that Aaron used so well of resource confirmation and, but still having to stick it under kind of that legislative vehicle. So I think we're making progress on it. Absolutely. As soon as you say categorical exclusion, the hair on the back of people's necks stand up, and then we've got to get into this phase. And so we're continuing to do that. And I think thanks to the great work of NREL and DOE, we're making some progress because they have both said we need to do this, and they've testified in front of Congress as such. And people are kind of warming to the idea that we are not trying to get around NEPA in any way. We just need to be able to drill some of these resource confirmation wells as quickly as possible.
And something I'd add that I think maybe gets lost on people sometimes as well is that there are potentials where that categorical exclusion would not apply, particularly where there's extraordinary circumstances. So if there is a sensitive tribal resource, if there is impacts to an endangered species, those can prevent that application of the categorical exclusion and require the completion of an EA. So nobody's trying to ram through, a confirmation well that's going to displace the critical habitat of an endangered species. There are protections in place that would limit its application in those scenarios.
So the next question we got from the audience is on regulatory challenges related to geothermal on private or state lands. Are there obstacles there? Do you guys have thoughts?
So obviously it's easier on private lands. We still have to deal with state regulators. And then you typically run into kind of these air pollution control boards and so forth. And to hit on kind of what I spoke to earlier, new geothermal is a whole lot easier to permit when you can say, we have no air emissions, we're not doing this. And, but, local governments pose their own issues sometimes. We just gave a seminar, internally here at ORMAT to our colleagues in the projects department and so forth to kind of say, here's the tiered process. There's a federal process, there's a state process, and a local process. But the state process, if you can find private lands with geothermal resources on them, you will be able to permit them more quickly. And that's the dream. It just so happens in the Western US where they're very prominent, BLM owns or operates or manages about 90% of the land in the state of Nevada. And then in California, they took their state law to be very close. It's called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And it's actually probably, I would say, slightly more painful than NEPA sometimes. So where we see improvements in, it's a state by state process. And I think for anyone looking at this development, you have to know your province, your state, this location, and, kind of talk to the experts on the best way to pursue this, to do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. In California, we get to do NEPA and CEQA. So as my colleague, Jonathan Loiskal likes to say, they like to make the difficult impossible there.
So another question from the audience. Is it true that the solar and wind lobby has begun to actively oppose geothermal legislation, at least in the US? Any of you guys want to say something about that?
I would say it's not true.
Not true. Okay.
Yeah, and certainly in Canada, I've not heard that. One of the things that in terms of geothermal and wind and solar is the Alberta government has specifically said that it does not want to support an industry that it has to compensate in some way. And we point out repeatedly that the wind and solar industry growth has been hugely supported in their early stages by government incentives and various things. So I don't know, maybe they think that we might take it away, but I have certainly not in the Canadian context heard of any opposition.
How about issues specific to or regulatory challenges specific that are unique to oil and gas well reuse? So I don't know if that's come across your desk, Lorenzo, but are there specific issues if you're trying to reuse an oil and gas well? And I think you're on mute. Or is there anybody else? Well, oh, there we go. We got Lorenzo.
Sorry about that. Not sure how that happened. So as many may know, the Energy Act of 2020 included verbiage with regards to co-production of geothermal from an oil and gas well, a producing oil and gas well. And so we've seen a little interest in that at this point. Again, probably a little bit more talk than action at this point. So we are effectively prepared to handle it if it comes. We do have a non-competitive lease application that we would have such a proponent submit, and we would go through the process to issue that lease. I would be a little cautious. I think it'd be a word of caution out there to the geothermal folks or even an oil and gas producer. If you're going to try to co-produce geothermal from an oil and gas well, for one, you'll probably need more than one oil and gas well producing fluid that's hot enough to produce geothermal. So you're probably looking at something more that would be a very small power plant to provide electricity for there on a project site or something like that. The hinge is that the oil and gas well has to be producing. So if oil and gas production stops, the geothermal would necessarily have to stop as well. And so that's kind of a tough one if you invest in a geothermal power plant off of co-production from an oil and gas well, and that oil and gas well stops production. So the geothermal would have to stop. So Maybe we'll see some additional legislation in the future, improving on what we've seen from the Energy Act of 2020. But I would say it's a word of caution out there to oil and gas producers to make sure they kind of know what they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, piggybacking off of Lorenzo, I think what that is most conducive to is some of these more small modular units that we've seen in the past that could be used in lieu of, say, a diesel generator on site. And we have an organization within NREL, JICEA, the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, that is a collective that includes both fossil fuel and renewable energy interests that does look to how do you help begin to decarbonize even fossil fuel industries and reduce their demand on additional fossil fuel and find ways to create that bridge nexus between renewable energy. And I think this is an opportunity for that for on-site generation. But as Lorenzo said, I don't think this is designed for a 50 megawatt power plant co-located with the resource. I think it really is for in lieu of diesel generation at the site itself.
And for those of you who are interested in that, it's been done. I will give a plug to Southern Methodist University in Texas has looked at a lot of oil and gas wells in West Texas. And ORMAT, in conjunction with the Department of Energy, did a small geothermal unit at the Rocky Mountain Oil Test Center, or Teapot Dome, where they had a water break. And we ran it through, just as Aaron said, a small, I think it was 250 kW, small binary modular system that can be moved on the back of a truck bed. And that project actually moved to Florida as part of another DOE fossil test. So all of that data out there is public, and it's an exciting application. I think Lorenzo hit the nail on the head. You typically have to have a lot of these wells coming together to generate a sizable amount of power. And communication like this in Pivot is hugely important, because when we started talking to folks, an oil and gas person's idea of a lot of water and real hot is very different than a geothermal developer's. So we ran into that a bunch to say, oh, that's not quite as hot as we thought. And while that's an annoying amount of water for you, it pales in comparison to the 5,000 gallons per minute we want to pump per megawatt for a geothermal project.
Paul, that's a great segue though, because I would say that, and Lorenzo, what you have mentioned in terms of be careful, right? Because if you stop producing the oil and gas, then what happens with that heat? And that's why I want to decouple geothermal in terms of the regulatory framework, the heat from the oil and gas. Of course, the issue in Canada and in Alberta in particular are what are called orphaned wells. So these are wells which are suspended. And we've been trying to make that. The government had hoped, I think, that geothermal would be the solution to all these oil and gas wells. Well, it's not the case, for exactly the reason that Paul had mentioned. I grew up in Alberta. I didn't know how small an oil and gas well until I went back 20 years later after working in the geothermal industry. And thought, those are really tiny wells. Like, what can they do anything with those? And of course, in the context of Alberta, the transfer of a well, it's the liabilities that are the issue. And who is going to accept the liability for that well in the next generation of its usefulness? So that's a big hurdle that we have.
So we got another question from the audience, and this audience member is asking, is heat a mineral? Is this different state by state and country by country? Seems like this introduces a lot of uncertainty for any oil entity thinking of doing this at global scale. So does the difference that we would see in sort of the regimes for who owns the heat, or what kind of rights are associated with heat, does the variance across countries and across states, is that too complex for an oil major or a big company to handle at a global scale?
So maybe I'll just jump in here, because I've been the one that in the Alberta market have been advocating that heat be a separate commodity. And that is because in the context of Alberta, right now they have on the books a regulatory framework that has just been introduced. It is law, but it has not yet been enacted. And in that, they stipulate that geothermal is a mineral, and you have to hold the mineral rights. The mineral rights in Alberta are petroleum, natural gas, metallic minerals, and industrial minerals. So that is why I have been, and obviously there are, most of Alberta is already allocated in terms of rights. So if a geothermal company were to go and look at how can we make a project commercial, they need to purchase the oil and gas rights, the PNG rights. We're talking about purchase costs of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And there's where you get into the commodity value, heat. And I've heard a number of the presentations saying that the heat value is 10 times less to like 100 times less. So a geothermal project cannot afford to purchase those petroleum rights. It just will not be commercially viable. So this is why it needs to be separated. And in direct answer to the question, it is different in different countries and even in the provinces. And obviously it's different globally, depending on what their current regulatory framework is.
Yeah, speaking to you,
but I would just say to the last part of that original question, no, it is not too complicated for an oil and gas major to figure out.
Yes, I agree.
Ormat does it. We are a very small company considered, compared to an oil and gas major. I like to, point to our total capex is probably what oil and gas folks spend on research and development, and we operate plants in Indonesia, Kenya, Guatemala, Honduras, North America. 21 countries around the world we've supplied equipment. If we can do it, an oil and gas major can do it. And if you can permit offshore oil and gas development, geothermal is going to be a walk in the park for them.
Yeah, piggybacking on this for the states, it is all over the place. I don't think it's, that complex once you look into it for a major to endeavor into the space, but, there might be temperature thresholds below which it's a water right, above which it's a mineral right. It might run with the surface in some states. There might be caveats on what is included within that mineral right. Do you have the right to the lithium and other minerals within the brine? So it is an interesting space that there's a lot of state regulation that is distinct across the West. But again, I think it's just a matter of understanding what state you're operating in. And I think you can work with any of those regimes. It's just understanding what that regime is.
How do you foresee underground injection control programs being involved with deep geothermal? Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, I've already mentioned about pore space. So this is something that the regulatory agencies are going to have to get their mind around if they haven't already, because the injection is competition for pore space. And in an oil and gas producing area, your competition is oil field brine disposal. That's going to compete with the geothermal injection. And then obviously what's coming, at the train coming towards us is CO2 sequestration.
Another question from the audience. What is the state in the US with the easiest regulatory road for geothermal development in the panelists' view? So assuming we're not doing federal land, if you're going to do state land, what's the easiest one to do?
Well, it's a real trick question, because if you could pick your state, Wyoming would probably be good, or West Virginia, but we haven't found a lot of geothermal development there. Texas would also be probably pretty good, but you have to drill really deep, and then it gets really expensive. So unfortunately, that's the beauty of geothermal, is we don't get to pick the state with the best regime in it. The geothermal resource picks us, and we get to deal with it. And if you're a big believer in Murphy's Law, I often tell the story that, we tend to find lots of exciting things around, geothermal resources close to the surface. And that was because people long before us were quite a bit smarter than us and built their villages there. And the bugs and bunnies like to hang out there and die. And so when we are trying to develop geothermal projects, we go through all sorts of neat archaeological finds, all sorts of neat, animal remains, etc., where that geothermal resource manifested close to the surface. So Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky question to answer. I want to go back to what Cathy was talking about just for a second on kind of, I didn't fully understand the question on deep underground injection, but the hot topic button today is enhanced geothermal systems and looking at designing some of these reservoirs subsurface. And I would say, at Ormat, we did a couple EGS projects in the US at Desert Peak and Brady. And we did that under very strict protocols from the Bureau of Land Management that developed these protocols using experts from all over the world. And so a lot of that work has been done to allow us to, permit these projects and start to look at, unique injection or enhanced geothermal systems or hot rock applications in the West. And so there's a pathway there for those interested in that we can build on and continue to proceed down very aggressively.
So we got a couple international questions. So with all of the lessons learned in the US and Canada, what are your suggestions to policymakers in countries where geothermal energy is still in the early stages of development? I would say it's maybe in the early stages even in the US and Canada, but let's, developing nations that haven't gotten started yet at all with geothermal, what should they be doing?
So I'll just jump in and say, look to the nations that do have a regulatory framework that works for both the public, so in the public interest, as well as in the developer's interest. So look at what their systems are like and try not to make it too complex, and make sure that you are dealing with all of those aspects of what geothermal can be, that holistic view. And don't forget, so Paul, in terms of Nevada, they don't have competition for pore space yet. They will have when they're talking about carbon sequestration. And that's when, how much can we jam into that pore space is going to be important. So look at other jurisdictions that are doing it and doing it well.
So who would you point them to, Cathy, or anybody? Who's the model?
Well, certainly, I do think that the U.S. Has a system that works. As I've worked in 22 different countries around the world and geothermal, they're all a little bit different. Because the low-hanging fruit in geothermal is the sedimentary basins. And in the sedimentary basins, you are dealing with an existing oil and gas infrastructure. Whether we're talking about the Netherlands, whether we're talking about the North Sea, you've got an existing regulatory framework dealing with gas and oil wells. So use that. Don't try to reinvent the wheel.
I would echo that, and without telling BLM how brilliant they are and how we hope that they permit our wells quicker and faster because they're the best in the world, I would say, I think what Cathy said is important. And I think geothermal development varies widely, whether you're chasing low temperature resources in the Western US or very high entropy resources with high pressure in Iceland or the Kenya or Rift zone. So I think for those international folks, listening, I think, evaluate your geothermal resource and then look to a country similar to you who have developed it. We didn't discuss here, there are big changes where, sometimes the country owns the geothermal, resource, or, the tender comes out and it's a very different structure than what we see in the US today. So I would, look for an analogous development and country structure. And there isn't probably, if you can't find an example of a country with similar resource and similar, ownership structure and so forth, let us know and we'll help you find one, because I think there's been enough development in enough countries around the world looking at that. And, whether it's Turkey or Germany or what, there's just so many different structures, and we've developed hundreds of megawatts in many of these sectors that we can share that information. And that's why forums like this are so critically important, to have that discussion and share that information from country to country moving forward.
We got an audience member from Chile who wants to know about the regulations in South America. So are there regulations making it difficult to explore or generate or produce from geothermal resources in comparison with North America? So does anybody have thoughts on the South American situation?
Well, having worked in Chile and Argentina and Peru, I can add something to that. So in Argentina, geothermal fluids are classified as endogenous fluids under the Minerals Act. Chile, it's a similar kind of thing. And Peru, a little bit different. I mean, both of those, I mean, all three of those countries, you know, do not yet have a geothermal industry. They're hoping to develop them. And I would encourage them, and I have been encouraging them to look to other jurisdictions to develop that.
And we built a power plant in Chile for our colleagues at Enel Green Power, who are also a fountain of information on this. So I think, you know, I encourage you to reach out to them. But again, you know, it's in these emerging markets, you have some additional complications, which are, you know, kind of country credit ratings and our willingness to go and spend large amounts of money to do exploration drilling. And in simple, you know, kind of simple issues of where can we sell the power? What is that regulatory? This is kind of a different regulatory regime, not so much permitting, but, you know, will that off-taker of power be there? Where are we sending that power? What's the long-term contract development? So when we look at trying to sign a 10 or 20-year power purchase agreement, we need great confidence that that utility will be there, that they will purchase all of that power to pay off that investment of drilling and developing that project. If we have those things, we tend to be able to develop projects there. And I don't know if it's South America or Central America, again, you know, we operate projects in Honduras and Guatemala and the French Caribbean country of Guadeloupe. So we have experience there. We are seeing those markets emerge, and we are very bullish on developing additional projects there.
So next question. This question says, seems like this all comes down to lobbying. What are the panelists' view of how this would play out if the oil and gas industry lobby began to lobby for geothermal? Very direct question.
It would expedite things greatly. And I think Cathy hit the nail on the head earlier. While oil and gas talks the good talk, they haven't shifted, you know, they are preserving what they have less than the fossil industry, probably because the rate of return is phenomenal. If you drill a successful oil and gas well, and the payback on a geothermal well is about 10 years, and you got to operate a project for about 20. But I think in a very short answer, if they shifted gears and said this categorical exclusion should apply, we want to put people to work in this sector, we won't be talking about this in 2022.
Great. So maybe Aaron or Lorenzo, this is a good question for you. Do we need a geothermal czar that sits above and across all engaged agencies to help organize and push forward? Would that be valuable?
I don't know about a geothermal czar, but there is, again, back to the Energy Act of 2020, they did reinitiate the National Renewable Energy Coordination Office that applies to wind, solar, and geothermal on federal lands. This was previously done through actions at the agency level. This is now a congressional mandate to develop and sign this MOU that would involve, you know, the Forest Service, BLM, Army Corps. I mean, I think that's the type of vehicle we need, just not a single person necessarily, but a mechanism to coordinate across all the federal approvals. That it also allows for states and tribes to join on to that MOU if they would like. That's another issue, is just that cooperative federalism aspect or cooperative government aspect with tribal nations. But I don't think it needs to be one person so much as just open communication and better coordination amongst the agencies. Lorenzo, anything?
Yeah, and I think Aaron hit it well. You know, the Energy Act of 2020 mandates that the Department of Interior enter into a MOU with other agencies and other agencies and whatnot. So, and then develop a renewable energy coordination office. And so all of those things are currently underway.
Okay, real quick, we're getting a little bit short on time, but treatment of fracturing from a regulatory perspective. So if is it different from oil and gas fracking from in terms of how the regulations look at it? And this person's thinking of the various frac bans. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
So I'll try to answer that at first here. you know, in geothermal, we deal with induced seismicity from, you know, hydraulic stimulation, as we like to refer to it. And so there's the DOE induced seismicity protocol. The BLM has also implemented some guidance based on research from folks at USGS and Lawrence Berkeley Livermore Lab and whatnot. And so we've developed a framework that we feel quite comfortable we can deal with projects that would propose hydraulic stimulation that could result in induced seismicity. So we feel quite confident we can start to handle those kind of projects as they come more and more.
What about tax credits? You know, what are other kinds of incentives? What do the panelists think is important?
The extension of the production tax credit was huge for geothermal, puts us on a level playing field with other developers, and we need to see it extended, and I think all technology treated the same. And the fact that Congress recognized that is huge. And I think a geothermal czar would be brilliant if Richard Branson or Chris Anderson want to do it. And if they don't, we should get Bezos involved.
All right, so we are out of time here. So I want to close by thanking each of our 4 panelists for sharing their insights with us for this past hour plus. I hope it was not only informative and interesting to our audience, but gives us some clarity on where, as an industry, we need to be going on policy matters. And thank you to our audience for spending time with us today. Pivot 2021 is still going strong with many more panels and speakers to come through today and tomorrow. So we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you all.